All right, so let's start with the buyer remedies for when the seller breaches. What are the remedies available to the buyer? Now, the CISG permits several different remedies, and these remedies can even be stacked upon one another as long as we are trying to match the contractual expectation of the party. So here we are talking about seller breach and the buyer's remedies. And the first thing a buyer can do, one of the remedies they can seek, is to require the seller to perform, a right to performance. In the common law in the UCC, we call this specific performance. Specific performance means do what it is you obligated yourself to do in the contract. Now, specific performance is a very unusual remedy, and it is something that is not often granted, only occurs in situations where the subject matter of the contract is unique. For instance, if I was selling a classic car, a 1967 Corvette or something along those lines, and there are not any other substitute goods on the market, I could sue for your failure to sell me the car, and I would ask for you as a remedy to sell me the car. The buyer can also fix additional time. The buyer has the right to fix additional time for the performance of the contract. You notify me as a seller that you can't deliver the goods by December 1st. I, as a buyer, have a right to say, okay, but you can deliver the goods by December the 15th. So a buyer has a right to fix additional time. Now, the third remedy is called, in the UCC and in the common law, we call this rescission. And in the CISG, we call this avoidance, a right to avoid the contract. And when a party avoids the contract, then the parties are going to be placed in their pre-contract position. The contract is simply canceled, no obligations remain, both parties can walk away as they were before the contract. A right of price reduction, this means when the goods arrive and the goods are not conforming to the contract. However, the buyer may have a use for the goods, then the buyer may pay the market price for the goods that were actually sent as a remedy. So if it involves, say, a computer manufacturer who is looking for 256 gigabyte hard drives and orders those and instead receives 128 gigabyte hard drives, the buyer, who may have a use for those hard drives, even though they are non-conforming, may pay a reduced amount, and that reduced amount would be the market price. And finally, monetary damages. We're going to talk about monetary damages in a separate note, so let's move on quickly from there. Now, one of the things to remember about remedies and damages is the buyer has a duty to mitigate. That means the buyer must do whatever it takes to minimize the damages, to make the damages as low as possible. And the primary responsibility of the buyer is to what we call cover. And cover means the purchase of substitute goods. Cover means the purchase of substitute goods, meaning a buyer who has failed to receive the goods from the seller must go out into the marketplace and attempt to purchase substitute goods. Those substitute goods may cost more than the contract price, and the buyer then can sue the seller for the difference between the contract price that it was supposed to pay and the market price that it actually paid. Talk a little bit more about specific performance. Specific performance means that a buyer can require the seller to perform its contractual obligations. But keep in mind, specific performance is a harsh remedy only used in most countries for where monetary damages are not available. I say this remedy is subject to availability under domestic law. It's very difficult in the United States to obtain specific performance. In a common law country, generally, the preference is for monetary damages, money damages. In a civil law country, there may be more of a feeling in favor of a right to performance, a right to specific performance. Do what it is that you obligated yourself to do in the contract. Now, for our purposes in this class, understand that specific performance is rarely awarded and generally only used where in the subject matter of the contract is rare, where there are no substitute goods by which a buyer can mitigate its damages, meaning the good that is being sold is unique, one of a kind. Right to avoidance, we said avoidance is a buyer's right to avoid a contract, meaning to cancel the contract. If a seller commits a fundamental breach, remember fundamental breach, the buyer has the right to avoidance. It's only, however, when there is a fundamental breach. If there's a less than fundamental breach, or what we call a simple breach, this right to avoid the contract, to cancel the contract, does not exist. Now, if a buyer does exercise this right to avoidance, the parties return to their pre-contractual position, meaning the buyer is under no obligation to pay the seller has no obligation to sell goods to the buyer. So if the buyer discovers that the market price is less than what the contract price was, the buyer can avoid the contract, declare it canceled, and then go out and pay for goods at the market price and save itself money over what the contract price was. So again, in the case of fundamental breach, a buyer has a right to avoidance. We've mentioned this before. Buyer's right to price reduction occurs when a buyer wants to retain the goods even though they are non-conforming. And in exchange, the buyer has the right to pay a lesser amount for the goods, meaning the buyer can withhold a part of the purchase price to offset the reduced value of the non-conforming goods. Using the example I used previously, if the seller ships 128 gigabyte hard drives rather than the contractual amount of 256 gigabyte hard drives, the buyer can retain those non-conforming hard drives and pay to the seller the market price of those goods. So the buyer has a right to price reduction. A buyer has a right to money damages. Now, again, we're going to talk about money damages in a separate lecture, but the general measure of money damages is the difference between the contract price and the market price. What did you expect to spend for the good versus what did you actually spend for the good? And that difference is what we call compensatory damages, the damages that are going to compensate for the loss of the benefit of the bargain. Now, as I mentioned, the seller has a right to cure, and that seller's right to cure can affect the buyer's remedies. Now, the right to cure only applies in cases where the breach is less than fundamental, meaning the seller shipped non-conforming goods or the seller shipped goods late. In the cases where breach is not fundamental, the seller has a right to cure its non-performance. It can ship the goods. So in that previous example of the right to price reduction, that right to price reduction is going to be dependent on the seller's right to cure. If the seller sends 128 gigabyte hard drives and the buyer notifies the seller that they're going to keep them and pay a reduced price, the seller has a right to send the conforming goods, the 256 gigabyte hard drives, and the buyer must pay for those goods and return the non-conforming goods. Now, the return of the non-conforming goods is done at the seller's expense. Nevertheless, the seller's right to cure can void a buyer's right to price reduction.